What if the most foundational accounts of human civilization are incomplete? What if the narratives we accept as the absolute beginning are in reality merely the second chapter of a story far grander, older, and perhaps more unsettling than we dare to imagine? We often turn our attention to the arid lands of Mesopotamia, to the birthplace of writing, law, and complex society, Sumer. We speak of the cuneiform tablets, the echoes from the deep past that first formalized the creation myth, the Great Flood, and the precise lineage of kingship. For decades, the dominant conversation has centered on the figures known as the Anunnaki, the beings, whether literal or allegorical, who are said to have descended from the heavens to initiate civilization, to organize the chaos, and ultimately to engineer the very framework of human labor and knowledge. Their arrival is treated by many as the definitive historical marker, the absolute zero point from which our recorded history begins to spin outward. It is a compelling narrative, deeply woven into the fabric of fringe archaeology and historical revisionism. It offers answers to the sudden and inexplicable leap that Sumerian culture took seemingly overnight from Neolithic simplicity to architectural and mathematical genius. Yet those who study the ancient clay, not just for the bold declarations of power, but for the quiet spaces between the lines, begin to sense a profound omission. We are so focused on the spectacle of the arrival, on the descent of those who came from the sky, that we rarely pause to consider the state of the world they found upon landing. The Sumerian texts, masterpieces of dense record-keeping, are incredibly detailed about the tasks assigned, the cities built, the laws laid down, and the conflicts fought by these celestial visitors. But when we press them on the world before their presence, when we look for the true antecedents, the state of terrestrial affairs preceding the dictates of the Anunnaki, the tablets respond with a silence that is not empty, but heavy with suggestion. It is this silence, this vast echoing cavity of history, immediately preceding the accepted dawn of civilization, that holds the key to the next great intellectual frontier. We must ask, was the earth merely a primordial, untamed wasteland of mud and wilderness, waiting for the gods to impose order? Or did the Anunnaki arrive into an environment already structured, already governed by principles and systems they did not create, but merely adapted or perhaps usurped? To truly engage with the deeper meaning of these ancient writings, we must move beyond the literal interpretation of the gods who came down and begin to investigate the texts that speak, indirectly but consistently, of the structures of existence that preceded the installation of the Anunnaki hierarchy. This requires us to look past the Enuma Elish and the king list's dramatic declarations, and into the more esoteric, ritualistic, and often fragmentary descriptions of the cosmological background. Consider the sheer scale of the time implied by these accounts. The Sumerian king list often extends back hundreds of thousands of years, referencing rulers who reigned for epochs so vast they defy human comprehension, blurring the line between history and deep mythology. If the Anunnaki system was only installed at a certain point in the planetary cycle, what vast engine of existence drove the world during those immeasurable periods that came before? The subtle clues buried within certain ritualistic liturgies and cosmological dictionaries suggest that the world the Anunnaki stepped onto was not a blank slate, but a meticulously constructed, though perhaps dormant, stage. A system of energy, architecture, and even a residual form of awareness was already in place. It is a chilling recognition. The civilization we identify as the oldest might have been built directly upon the remnants of something even older, something whose structure the newcomers recognized as inherently powerful and usable. We are, in essence, becoming archaeologists of time itself, sifting through the linguistic dust left by scribes who, perhaps intentionally or perhaps through mere ignorance, glossed over the foundational data. They focused on the present utility of the Anunnaki's rule, while treating the antecedent world as a given, a background assumption that did not require specific explanation to their contemporary audiences. But for us, separated by millennia, that background assumption is everything. We are searching for the blueprint that was already drawn before the celestial architects arrived. This journey demands patience and deep reflection. We must train ourselves to recognize the shadow history that hides in plain sight. If you feel the weight of this possibility, that the story is far longer than the pages we have found, then you are ready to delve deeper into these layers of inquiry. Pause here with us for a moment and truly consider the weight of this silence. If these texts hold the genesis of humanity as we know it, what does it truly signify if they also describe a genesis before the gods themselves arrived? Understanding this requires attention to detail, a willingness to see the patterns of cyclical return rather than linear progression. This is not just a tale of ancient aliens or creation myths. It is an investigation into the cyclical nature of time and memory. The fact that the texts even allow for a before implies that the organization of life on Earth follows patterns that transcend any single pantheon. It suggests that the arrival of the Anunnaki was not the act of creation ex nihilo, but an act of inheritance, the taking over of a system whose laws and energies were already established. This implies continuity, even through periods of apparent global amnesia or catastrophe. Think of it this way: when a new regime takes power in our modern world, they immediately set about renaming streets and tearing down monuments associated with the prior administration. They install new symbols and rewrite textbooks. But the underlying infrastructure, the plumbing, the electrical grids, the foundational architectural geometry, often remains, merely repurposed and overlaid with the new authority's insignia. The Sumerian accounts, when read with this critical lens, suggest a similar operation. The Anunnaki brought their own culture and mandates, yes, but they integrated into a profound existing geometric and energetic framework of the planet. What are these residual structures? The cuneiform speaks of systems of measure, of agricultural schedules, and cosmological alignments that seem too perfect, too integrated into the planetary mechanics to be the spontaneous invention of beings merely arriving from space. These ancient alignments suggest an intrinsic knowledge of Earth-specific cycles, a deep wisdom woven into the environment that existed long before the city-states of Uruk or Nippur were established. This framework suggests the existence of powerful organizational principles, perhaps an awareness, an intelligence, or even a precursor civilization that governed the world during the aeons before the Anunnaki's celebrated intervention. This notion challenges the very premise of the descent as absolute creation. Instead, we are left with the uneasy recognition that the Anunnaki themselves may have been responding to a signal, a cycle, or perhaps even an environmental necessity dictated by the enduring laws of the world that was already there. Their arrival may have been timed not by their own divine whim, but by a predetermined planetary schedule, a galactic clock that marks the rise and fall of various organizational systems on Earth. If you are beginning to feel the deep echo of this forgotten time, if you sense that we are looking at something far more profound than simple mythological explanation, then consider joining this investigation fully. Engage with the depth of this history. Subscribe and like this video so that the mechanisms of the digital age recognize the significance of this inquiry, ensuring that these forgotten pathways of knowledge remain illuminated for others. Share your initial thoughts below. Do you believe ancient history is defined by linear progress or by repeating forgotten cycles? Let us ground this exploration in shared curiosity, not just passive reception. As we move forward, We must look at the specific language used to describe the organization of water, the flow of energy, and the establishment of centers of power. Before the named temples of the Anunnaki were dedicated, it is within these incredibly precise, yet often overlooked technical descriptions, found not in the dramatic epics, but in the drier administrative records, that we locate the first tangible signs of the predecessor structure. The tablets speak of powerful flows and specific geographical nexus points already functioning, already requiring maintenance. They refer to certain instruments and specific stones as always having been there, implying a permanence that predates the fleeting rule of the gods themselves. The texts, read carefully, reveal a world not chaotic, but perhaps dormant, resting between grand acts of celestial administration, a world where the infrastructure of power was merely waiting for a new management team to arrive and activate it. The Sumerian Text, often invoked for the arrival of the Anunnaki, contains the unintentional record of this older power, a power that was vast, systemic, and utterly silent in its disappearance. We are seeking the ghost in the machine of history. This ghost is the foundation, the very bedrock upon which the Anunnaki built their magnificent yet temporarily limited empire. To truly understand the legacy they left, we must now turn our gaze not to the inscriptions detailing their wars, but to the quieter, almost overlooked passages, the cryptic descriptions of the world that was waiting. It is here, in the technical terminology and the astronomical codes, that we begin to decipher the language of what truly existed before the Anunnaki arrived on Earth. In the next part, we will analyze the specific cuneiform phrases that describe the state of the planet just prior to the Great Descent, revealing the true nature of this predecessor framework. What do we truly forget, and why is that act of forgetting often more powerful than the memory itself? This question lingers heavily over the scorched earth of Mesopotamia, casting a long shadow across the meticulously preserved clay tablets that tell the story of the Anunnaki arrival. We tend to view history, particularly the deep history of civilization, as a series of definitive beginnings, a zero point from which progress springs. But what if the Sumerian narrative, the very foundation of recorded civilization, is not an origin story at all, but a paradigm shift, a profound and violent re-encoding of an already ancient world? If the Anunnaki, these cosmic travelers, arrived with the technology and the organizational structure necessary to engineer life, to establish Eridu as the first city, and to bequeath the Me, the divine decrees that govern civilized life, then they must have encountered something already existing. Nothing appears from a void. Even chaos requires a medium. Our journey into the cuneiform archives suggests that the pre-Anunnaki world was not simply an empty landscape waiting for divine intervention, but an era defined by a forgotten inheritance, a time when other forces, other intelligences were already at work, orchestrating a subtle, non-technological order. The ancient texts give us oblique references, not clear declarations. They speak of the primeval sea, of Abzu, the sweet waters, and Tiamat, the chaotic salt waters. These are often anthropomorphized as deities locked in cosmic combat, yet viewed through a geological and civilizational lens, they may represent something far more unsettling, the residue of a previous epoch. Imagine not two gods fighting, but two distinct environmental, or perhaps even societal states that the Anunnaki needed to subdue or integrate. Abzu and Tiamat, therefore, become the ultimate witnesses to the time before, a time characterized by immense elemental power, operating according to rules utterly alien to the precise mathematical governance introduced by the Anunnaki. The great unease that rises from the deepest strata of Sumerian mythology is the uncomfortable realization that the first generation of Anunnaki were not creators of the cosmos, but rather ambitious usurpers of a planetary system already settled into its own complex cycles. Their arrival was less a genesis and more an interregnum, a calculated insertion into an established order. Why would a supremely advanced civilization dedicate so much energy to documenting the conquest of primeval forces if those forces were truly formless and mindless? The sheer effort implies resistance, and resistance requires intelligence, even if it is intelligence organized along profoundly different principles than those of the newcomers. We are forced, then, to look beyond the celebratory king lists and temple hymns, and to examine the strange silence in the archaeological record just beneath the foundations of the earliest ziggurats. What did the Anunnaki build upon? They chose sites of immense geophysical and energetic significance, locations already steeped in a certain ancient resonance. If we look closely at the language describing the founding of Eridu, the city often credited to Enki, it is described less as a pure creation and more as a taming or recalibration of the surrounding environment, particularly the marshlands where the fresh and salt waters met. This suggests a direct confrontation with the remnants of the previous dominion, the silent, watery expanse that held the true memory of what came before the organized arrival of structured civilization. To truly understand this pre-Anunnaki reality, we must accept the possibility that the oldest human myths function like sophisticated encryption. They contain the truth, but veiled behind layers of symbolism intended both to honor the past and to simultaneously make it politically palatable to the new order. The Anunnaki, in establishing their dominion, required absolute historical precedence. Anything that challenged their status as the originating source of knowledge and authority had to be either eliminated or subsumed into their own mythological hierarchy. This is how the subtle, pre-existing observers, those entities or proto-civilizations that managed the world during the watery epoch, were transformed into monsters, demons, or simply footnotes in the grand saga of celestial conflict. The very act of seeking this forgotten information is a profound psychological undertaking. It forces us to question the foundational myths we have inherited. If you find yourself deeply unsettled by this historical erasure, by the implication that the history we have been taught is merely the second chapter, a sanitized version written by the victors, then you are engaging with the essential mystery of this investigation. This is not passive viewing, it is a shared excavation of the forgotten deep time. Pause for a moment and consider, what narrative of the past feels most instinctively wrong to you? Sharing your thoughts below, even a single word like Tiamat or observer, helps weave this collective tapestry of understanding. If this journey into the silent archives holds significance for you, liking this video and subscribing ensures that you remain tethered to the investigation as we delve deeper into the layers of suppression. Our focus now must turn to the concept of imitation. If the Anunnaki arrived and installed a functioning society, complete with agriculture, law, and metallurgy, was this system genuinely novel? Or was it a sophisticated improvement on an existing structure? The Sumerian tablets repeatedly reference the knowledge that came down, the me bestowed upon humanity. Yet these decrees seem suspiciously comprehensive, almost too perfectly tailored to local conditions. If we examine the earliest recorded laws and agricultural practices, they display an uncanny understanding of the Mesopotamian ecosystem, knowledge that would typically take millennia for a newly landed civilization to acquire organically. This suggests that the Anunnaki may have acted as sophisticated librarians, interpreters, and administrators of a pre-existing library of planetary knowledge. The pre-Anunnaki world, therefore, was likely governed by beings or systems that understood the deep rhythms of Earth, the cycles of flood and drought, and the inherent energy channels of the planet, without the necessity of massive physical engineering. They were perhaps less concerned with erecting ziggurats that scraped the sky and more focused on harmonizing with the subtle, elemental forces symbolized by Abzu, the fresh subterranean waters, and Tiamat, the vast chaotic ocean. This brings us to the crucial, almost whispered fragments in the cuneiform, references to the Apkallu. These 7 antediluvian sages are often depicted as wise men who advised the earliest kings, but their origin is ambiguous. They are sometimes described as fishmen emerging from the Abzu, the freshwater domain, suggesting a deep aquatic connection to the planet's primary state. The Apkallu predate the deluge, predate the organized establishment of the Anunnaki proper, acting as a crucial epistemological bridge between the 2 great epochs. They are the living evidence that high intelligence and structured knowledge existed before the engineered human race and before the direct physical rule of the Anunnaki pantheon. Why were these Apkallu figures tolerated? Perhaps because their knowledge was essential. They represent the inherited understanding of the cycles of the world, the precise knowledge required to survive the inevitable cataclysmic resets, the great floods. The Anunnaki needed this foundational data to establish their civilization on stable ground. But once their own organizational structure was firmly in place, what became of the Apkallu? The texts imply their gradual phase-out, their knowledge becoming either obsolete or deliberately suppressed, ensuring that the new human creation would owe its allegiance solely to the divine engineers and not to the silent, watery observers of the deep past. This is the architectural evidence of the erasure, the shift from the watery wisdom of the Apkallu to the sky-bound authority of the Anunnaki. We are looking at a deliberate change in directional focus from the stabilizing horizontal energy of the terrestrial deep to the hierarchical vertical power structure associated with Nibiru and the heavens. The memory of the time before lingers in the shadows of this transition, trapped in the symbolism of the discarded fishmen who carried the secrets of the planet's genesis, secrets that contradicted the divine supremacy claimed by the newcomers. The knowledge they possessed, the secret of the waters, the true geometry of the Earth's energy, became a threat to the centralized control established by Enlil and Enki. We must scrutinize the implications of this shift. If the Anunnaki were merely colonizers who adapted existing infrastructure and suppressed the indigenous intelligentsia, the Apkallu, then the fundamental human concept of civilization is built not on innovation, but on a massive systemic act of historical occlusion. The Sumerian texts, when read with this lens of suspicion, stop being records of creation and start becoming manuals of administrative control. Documents designed to ensure that the newly manufactured workforce, Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker, looked upward for instruction, never downward or backward for its true roots. The most provocative clue lies in the repeated references to Tiamat's defeat. This mythic battle, often the centerpiece of Anunnaki propaganda, might not describe the defeat of a monster, but the systematic dismantling of a competing, perhaps more subtle civilization that held sway over the Earth. If Tiamat represented the established order, vast, fluid, resilient, and inherently part of Earth's primordial structure, then its destruction by Marduk, or sometimes Enlil, was the necessary prerequisite for the implementation of the new, rigid and structured authority. The fragments of Tiamat, often said to be used to construct the sky and the earth, are perhaps metaphorical references to the co-opting and repurposing of the previous civilization's resources and foundational knowledge. To pursue this deeper forgotten layer of history requires both patience and a willingness to confront uncomfortable ambiguities. We are dealing with concepts, beings, and organizational methods that predate our current understanding of time. If you have followed this dense investigation, recognizing the subtle, almost hypnotic connection between the deep past and the hidden elements of our present, then you are clearly one of the few dedicated explorers of this ancient mystery. Your sustained attention suggests a resonant understanding of the weight of this forgotten history. To ensure this investigation remains viable and reaches others who share this burning curiosity, please take a moment to confirm your commitment. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, to signal the importance of this deep dive content, and comment the specific phrase, "The waters remember." We must now turn our attention to the physical implications of this historical concealment. If the Anunnaki purposefully built their civilization upon the ruins of the Tiamat-Abzu epoch, what material evidence remains entombed beneath the sands of Sumer? What forgotten technological traces or monumental architecture might point definitively to the presence of these silent observers and their aquatic dominion? The next phase of our journey requires us to look not at the words on the tablets, but at the geological shadows left by a world that was deliberately engineered into oblivion, a world that existed in profound and complex structure long before the celestial arrival. The clay has spoken. Now the soil must confess. What if the most crucial revelations held within the cuneiform tablets are not what they explicitly state, but rather the monumental silences they contain? We have spent decades, generations even, deciphering the vivid narratives of the Anunnaki arrival, the crafting of humanity, the construction of the early cities, the genesis of civilization as we know it. Yet, the true power of the Sumerian record lies in the background hum, the almost subliminal frequency that suggests a vast library of events, beings, and structures that existed entirely outside the framework of their golden descent. These are the spectral echoes of a world that the chroniclers themselves struggled to define, a time so distant, so fundamentally alien to the human experience of the Mesopotamian valley, that it could only be described in terms of elemental forces and cosmic geometry, rather than the familiar anthropomorphism applied to the later pantheon. We must peer into the linguistic strata that precede even the mythological structure of Tiamat and Apsu, pushing past the chaos myth which serves as a convenient historical curtain. When the scribes speak of the primordial ocean, were they speaking of water in the conventional sense, or were they employing a highly refined metaphor for a state of pure, unstructured energy, a reservoir of potentiality from which the physical earth was later solidified? The texts that address this period often utilize verbs of observation rather than creation, a subtle but critical distinction. The later gods, the Anunnaki, are depicted as designers, architects, and miners, figures who actively manipulate the existing environment. But the preceding language speaks of beings or forces who merely observed the condensation of matter, who watched the initial solar systems settle into their orbits. This implies a hierarchy of engagement, those who stood at the absolute edge of time, mere witnesses to the physical formation of the cosmos, and those who arrived much later to harness the material and biological results. This suggests that the stage was set not by the arriving extraterrestrial deities, but by an even older, less corporeal intelligence, whose actions were purely foundational and vibrational. The profound intellectual estrangement this creates is palpable, challenging our understanding of what constitutes a beginning. If the Sumerians inherited knowledge of a celestial blueprint that governed the positioning of stars and the precise timing of planetary transits, knowledge that modern science only recently rediscovered, then this inheritance did not originate with the Anunnaki, who, according to the narratives, were more focused on gold mining and territorial disputes on Earth. This advanced celestial mapping must have been the legacy of the true first observers, those who possessed a macro-level understanding of the galactic mechanics. Take a moment to simply let this concept settle, this image of an immense, silent intelligence watching the swirling gas clouds coalesce into planets. If this narrative resonates, if you feel the pull of that deep history, that sense that the foundation beneath our accepted history is far thinner than we ever realized, I invite you to pause and reflect with us. This journey into the pre-history of the planet is a collective endeavor. Your active curiosity is the engine that drives this investigation forward. If you are captivated by these deep undercurrents of forgotten knowledge, take a moment to engage with the narrative. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to ensure you don't miss the next stage of the revelation, for the deepest secrets are often found in the fragments others overlook. We now turn to the unsettling implications of the cycles referenced in the most fragmented and archaic clay tablets. The conventional narrative presents the arrival of the Anunnaki as a singular, decisive event, a divine intervention that launched civilization. However, certain texts, preserved only in copies made centuries later by Babylonian scholars, speak not of a beginning, but of a return. They describe a mechanism of recurrence where highly advanced terrestrial and cosmic cultures rise and fall according to predictable astronomical and energetic alignments, a concept deeply unsettling because it removes the sense of unique agency from the Anunnaki themselves. Their coming, under this interpretation, was merely the latest instance of a stewardship cycle, an interval where the planet, having reached a certain evolutionary or energetic maturity, becomes available again for external governance or, perhaps more accurately, external harvesting. The recognition of this cyclical structure forces us to confront the nature of the precursor species. If the planet has been managed before, who were the original shepherds? The Sumerian lexicon possesses specific terms for beings connected intrinsically to the Earth's biosphere, yet distinct from the elemental spirits or the later gods. These are often translated imperfectly as the guardians of the inner wastes or those bound to the clay. Crucially, they are never depicted receiving offerings or demanding worship. Their description is functional, not religious. They were not divine rulers, but silent maintainers. Their duty, as vaguely implied, was to ensure the planetary systems, the atmospheric balance, the tectonic stability, perhaps even the energetic grid of the planet, remained operational during the vast periods when the main galactic overseers, the true observers, were absent. The eventual disappearance of these precursors is marked in the tablets by a period of profound geological instability, often conflated with the Great Deluge, yet clearly distinct from it in its cosmic causation. It suggests that when the cycles turned, or perhaps when a specific energetic threshold was crossed, the maintenance crew was either withdrawn or perished under the shifting conditions. This leaves us with the portrait of a planet running on residual energy, its systems degrading slowly, waiting for the next intervention. The arrival of the Anunnaki, then, might be less about creating something new and more about re-engineering an existing, decaying system, a vast planetary inheritance left derelict. This sense of inheritance is reinforced by the presence of what can only be described as the signature of the lost design. Scattered across various administrative and astronomical tablets are symbols, numerical ratios, and geometric patterns that bear no resemblance to Sumerian iconography or Akkadian mathematics. They are too precise, too foundational, implying a level of integrated knowledge that vastly precedes the rudimentary construction methods of Uruk or Lagash. These are not symbols of worship, but schematics, perhaps the residue of the preceding culture's technology, knowledge of planetary engineering left behind in highly protected archives that the Anunnaki themselves clearly accessed and utilized. When the texts speak of the tools of power that Enlil and Enki sought to secure, we might not be referring to mythological hammers or staffs, but highly sophisticated pre-existing mechanisms, perhaps even entire energetic infrastructures inherited from those silent guardians who dissolved into the fabric of the earth itself. This deep dive into the textual margins reveals an unwritten yet undeniable law of the void. The Anunnaki did not arrive to write their own rules in a vacuum. They arrived to occupy a space already shaped by a previous cosmic structure. Their mandates, their hierarchies, even their eventual conflicts appear to be constrained by a pre-existing cosmic law, a framework of physics and ethics established by the elder observers who merely witnessed the birth of matter. The Anunnaki, despite their immense power over nascent humanity, were themselves operating within a defined container, restricted by the foundational laws of the civilization that came before. If we interpret the Sumerian records as a continuous historical account rather than disconnected myths, we must accept the troubling implication. The golden age of the Anunnaki was merely a localized stewardship under the shadow of a far greater, silent reality. This shadow lengthens as we scrutinize the specific terminology surrounding the first terrestrial settlements, the Eridu Genesis that speaks of a specific time marker. This is the ultimate intellectual barrier we must breach, identifying the exact moment when the quiet observation ceased and active management began, the transition from the inherited silence to the period of the cosmic architects. We seek the subtle shift in the cuneiform structure, the moment when the language ceases to describe the planet in terms of geological and energetic potential, and begins describing it in terms of valuable resources and labor requirements. This precise inflection point is the door to the Elder Age, the instant when the ancient, silent structure of existence yielded to the interventionist drama that followed. If you have stayed with us on this meticulous journey, recognizing the vastness of the history that unfolded before even the first gods stepped upon the clay, you are now part of a privileged few who understand the true depth of the Sumerian inheritance. This is not mere speculation. It is the slow, painstaking reconstruction of a timeline intentionally fragmented. If the feeling of these layers of forgotten history resonates with your core sense of truth, it is imperative that you join our continuing investigation. Please subscribe to the channel to remain connected to the unfolding narrative. Ensure you like this video to signal the depth of your engagement, and to mark your presence at the edge of this profound discovery, comment the phrase, "The Inherited Silence." This is the secret door we must now step through, ready to examine the true nature of the beings who were here before the Anunnaki ever cast their colossal shadow across the Mesopotamian plains. The deepest parts of the story, those that speak to true planetary legacy, await in the next part of this chronicle. And so, we must look beyond the immediate narratives of conquest and creation, often attributed solely to the Anunnaki. We are compelled to ask, what does it mean to inherit a planet, and what evidence did they attempt to conceal, or perhaps simply fail to recognize, within the deep strata of Earth's existence? The Sumerian chronicles, those fragile clay tablets, do not just detail the arrival of sophisticated beings, they whisper of a time so vast, so utterly removed from the human scale of history, that even the Anunnaki's millennia-long dominion feels like a fleeting moment. We are forced into a contemplation of chronological echo, a resonance of power that lingers in the silence before the great arrival. The prevailing mythos focuses intensely on the engineering prowess of the newcomers, the mining operations, the establishment of Eridu, the forging of foundational institutions. But what if the greatest challenge the Anunnaki faced was not building something new, but understanding the ruins of what already was? The deep dive into these obscure texts, fragments often overlooked by mainstream archaeology, suggests that the infrastructure required for the Anunnaki's operations, especially the intricate control of planetary energy and geological resources, might not have been constructed from scratch. Instead, it seems they found subtle, residual markers, an architecture of power that had already been established, operating on frequencies perhaps alien even to their own advanced comprehension. We are speaking now of a civilization, or a structure of consciousness, that existed in what Sumerians referred to obliquely as the Age of Deep Waters, a term that signifies both geological antiquity and a state of profound collective amnesia. If the Anunnaki possessed a technology capable of modifying DNA and initiating large-scale resource extraction, they certainly possessed the tools to identify and dismantle previous systems. Yet, the texts suggest a more complicated reality, a reluctant inheritance. They utilize the existing planetary grid, the energetic ley lines, not because it was the most efficient path, but perhaps because activating this pre-existing infrastructure was the only way to achieve the immediate control they sought. It is the signature of a hurried occupation rather than a masterful planned colonization. Consider the immense, almost instantaneous nature of the early Sumerian city-states. They burst forth onto the Mesopotamian landscape with fully formed scripts, complex astronomical knowledge, and intricate legal systems. This rapid acceleration is often explained by the Anunnaki handing down civilization. But an alternative, deeply unsettling possibility arises from the obscure sections of the tablets. The Anunnaki were not passing down their own inventions, but rather activating latent protocols left behind by the first watchers. They were merely the custodians of a sophisticated manual they barely understood themselves. This perspective shifts the focus entirely from the Anunnaki's genius to their capacity for adaptation and, crucially, their capacity for redaction. To maintain their authority, they needed to ensure that the memory of the first watchers, the true original architects of the terrestrial power system, faded into indistinct myth. This is the mechanism of the Great Forgetting. The powerful silence surrounding the pre-Anunnaki era is not accidental. It is a meticulously enforced narrative void. And yet, the silence itself contains information. We must reflect on the nature of these preceding entities. If they left behind functioning energy grids and astronomical markers, were they physical beings in the same sense as the Anunnaki? The descriptions are maddeningly vague, leaning towards forms that were more energetic, perhaps crystalline or purely conceptual, entities that interacted with the planet not through mass and density, but through vibration and resonance. Their remnants would not be crumbling ziggurats, but deep subsurface alignments, structures observable only through mathematical equations or geomagnetic anomalies. This deep investigation into the chronological structure of the Sumerian accounts compels us, the modern observers peering through millennia of dust, to consider the frightening persistence of the past. It invites a necessary pause, demanding that we, too, question the foundational assumptions of human history. If you are following this journey, if these complex layers of antiquity resonate within your own search for truth, take a moment now to acknowledge this shared pursuit. This material is designed to challenge the very framework of historical understanding, requiring deep reflection and focused attention. If you find value in these detailed explorations, in the quiet unfolding of these forgotten texts, allowing this channel to grow by subscribing, liking, and sharing your own insights ensures that we can continue to bring these densely textured narratives to light. Your engagement is the essential fuel for uncovering these deeper truths, extending this collective investigation far beyond the surface narrative. Continuing our examination of the residual evidence, let us turn to the curious lack of narrative specificity regarding major global cataclysms before the flood myth that the Anunnaki themselves documented. It is as if history only truly began when they arrived. But cycles of destruction and renewal, the cosmic breathing of the planet, predate even the arrival of Nibiru. The first watchers, according to the inferences drawn from the most cryptic tablets, understood these cycles intimately. They didn't build to last forever because they knew nothing physical ever does. They built to survive the Great Purge, the inevitable cyclical cleansing of the planet, perhaps through non-physical means. The Anunnaki, being inherently material and resource-driven, misinterpreted this sophisticated resignation. They saw derelict infrastructure and assumed abandonment, failing to recognize that the original constructors had merely transcended the need for continuous physical presence. The greatest challenge for the Anunnaki wasn't defeating a predecessor. It was living within the shadow of a predecessor who had simply moved on, leaving behind tools that were double-edged. This explains the recurring motif in many ancient texts, not just Sumerian, but stretching into Egyptian and Vedic lore of an age of perfect geometry or etheric architecture. The Anunnaki were attempting to stabilize and weaponize this ethereal residue. This process of repurposing created the inherent instability we see referenced in later tablets, where the early management of Earth is described as chaotic, fraught with sudden, unexplained failures and technological setbacks. These setbacks were perhaps not design flaws in the Anunnaki's own equipment, but unforeseen reactions from the underlying dormant systems of the first watchers. Think of it this way. The Anunnaki connected their new, heavy machinery to a power grid designed for light, conceptual thought. The inevitable overload created geopolitical and atmospheric disturbances that eventually led to the legendary conflict between the Anunnaki factions, a conflict potentially rooted in the disagreement over how to manage a borrowed volatile planet. The Sumerian scribes, the Dubsar, those quiet keepers of knowledge, recorded these early struggles. Their texts are subtly embedded with an underlying tone of awe and caution directed not toward their current masters, the Anunnaki, but toward the invisible forces that still held sway over the Earth's core energies. These scribes, often trained in the deepest chambers of the ziggurats, where the air was heavy with geomagnetic resonance, were the ones most likely to interface, however unconsciously, with the faint residual signature of the prior civilization. What was the nature of this signature? It was the essence of sophisticated warning. The Anunnaki came seeking gold and stability. The first watchers had left behind a signal of return, a timed mechanism designed to reactivate when certain planetary conditions, perhaps astronomical alignments or a specific level of technological misuse, were met. This is the frightening heart of the forgotten era, the understanding that the Anunnaki were living on borrowed time, operating a system with a hidden self-destruct mechanism, a fail-safe designed to protect the planetary equilibrium from any overly destructive physical colonization. The sheer density of the cuneiform tablets, the obsessive detail regarding astronomical movements and geological pressures, takes on a new context under this interpretation. These were not just records for the sake of history, they were maintenance logs for a potentially explosive inheritance. The scribes were meticulously noting parameters, hoping to identify the critical threshold that would trigger the old system back to life, ushering in the next cyclical purge, the next great wash that would wipe the slate clean for the return of the first watchers, the original silent observers. We are left with the uneasy recognition that the history we have been taught, the history of creation and dominion by the Anunnaki, is merely an interlude, a brief, noisy interruption in the Earth's deeper cyclical rhythm. The texts, therefore, are not strictly about the Anunnaki themselves, but serve as encrypted messages regarding the inevitable reassertion of the planet's true, long-forgotten heritage. This heritage is the subject of profound debate among those who dare to decipher the most fragmented and damaged clay fragments. If you have followed the intricate pathways of this investigation so far, recognizing the immense weight of historical suppression, consider leaving a comment below with the phrase, "The cycle awaits," to confirm that you are truly listening to the deeper rhythm of the narrative. This acknowledgement acts as a signal, reinforcing the gravity of the subject matter we are exploring together. The deepest mystery remains centered on the transfer of power. Was there an agreement? Did the first Watchers willingly vacate, leaving behind a sort of cosmic caretaker contract for the Anunnaki? Or was this a forceful, if indirect, overthrow? The evidence points away from direct conflict and toward calculated disappearance. It suggests that the prior entities understood the universe operates on energy conservation and cyclical movement. They may have simply recognized that their particular phase of interaction with this physical plane was complete. The legacy they left behind is not military, but intellectual and energetic. It resides in the unexplainable precision of certain ancient sites across the globe, the placement of which defies basic surveying capabilities. Sites that seem to function as tuning forks, resonating with a pattern of energy that existed long before the Anunnaki stepped onto the Mesopotamian plains. These ancient markers, scattered and seemingly disconnected, may in fact be remnants of the first Watchers' global network, still humming faintly, awaiting the signal for full reactivation. The question then becomes highly practical and terrifying. Did the Anunnaki successfully neutralize this ancient planetary network, or did they merely put it into standby mode? The Sumerian texts, particularly those detailing the later periods of chaos and retreat, strongly suggest the latter. They withdrew, not necessarily defeated by internal conflict or external enemies, but perhaps because the borrowed machinery began to fail, or worse, began to respond to a command signal that was not their own. The history of the Anunnaki's departure from Earth could be read as a desperate escape from the consequences of activating something they were never truly meant to control. This narrative turn leads us directly into the heart of the great geological upheaval, the nature of the final mechanism that the Anunnaki left behind, and the evidence that their own departure was hastened by the reawakening of the true architects of this planet. We must now turn our attention to the specific physical clues they overlooked, the faint architectural whispers that survived their massive overlay, and what those elements suggest about the potential return of the pre-Anunnaki observers. If the evidence points to an organized society existing upon the Earth, not merely surviving, but thriving in a state of profound technological and perhaps spiritual sophistication, then we must confront the most difficult question of all. Why did they leave? Their departure, etched faintly into the clay tablets centuries later, is not recorded as a defeat, but as a systematic withdrawal. What force could compel a civilization of such caliber, capable of manipulating continental stone and understanding celestial mechanics on a scale we are only now beginning to comprehend, to simply pack their wisdom and depart the planetary stage? The answer, woven into the fabric of the Sumerian accounts, suggests a deep, unsettling reverence for the great cycle itself. It speaks of a consciousness that understood time not linearly, but cyclically, recognizing the rhythmic breathing of the cosmos. These primeval architects, the silent predecessors, appear to have been intimately aware of the impending celestial realignment, a gravitational shift perhaps, or a specific passage through a dense, volatile region of space that marked the end of an epoch. This was not a sudden disaster, but a scheduled inevitability. If we accept the premise of advanced foresight, their departure was not abandonment born of panic, but a calculated retreat guided by superior astronomical knowledge. They understood that the coming cataclysm, whether flood or fire, magnetic reversal or solar intensity spike, was not survivable by remaining anchored to a planet undergoing a traumatic metamorphosis. They saw the end of the stage, not the end of the play. This recognition forces us into a profound intellectual pivot. We are not looking for the ruins of a civilization that perished. We are looking for the controlled markers of a civilization that migrated, leaving behind only the essential tools and signposts for a future return. Or perhaps for those who might inherit their temporary lease. The sheer scale of the lingering structures, the colossal megaliths that defy known logistics, begin to transform in our minds from mere architectural marvels into something far more functional: terrestrial calibration points. They were not built for ceremony alone. They were anchors, perhaps energetic stabilizers or complex geopositioning devices designed to maintain the structural integrity of the planet's grid through the coming cosmic storm, or even to serve as silent beacons, signaling to the returning travelers that the turbulence had passed. The uneasiness settles in when we realize that the most massive monuments on Earth are merely the residue of an eviction notice, a temporary locking up of the property before the storm hits. The question then shifts from what they left to how they ensured the survival of their intellectual blueprint. The Sumerian cuneiform, which speaks volumes of the Anunnaki's arrival and subsequent governance, becomes frustratingly opaque when referencing the period immediately preceding it. It's as if a great silence descends upon the clay tablets, a deliberate editorial choice or a linguistic filter imposed by the newly established order. The scribes, recording history under the patronage of the incoming powerful beings, naturally prioritized the narrative of their patrons. They were documenting the genesis of the new world, inadvertently sidelining the sophisticated mechanisms of the previous era. We must read the silence between the lines of the cuneiform, the gaps that refuse explanation, as the most profound clue of all. The Anunnaki did not arrive on a dead planet. They arrived on a planet deliberately staged for their arrival. A world whose previous occupants had chosen to step back just long enough for the cycles to turn. This notion of a calculated retreat carries with it the heavy implication of inherited destiny. Did the primeval architects know the Anunnaki would come? Did they leave a vacuum specifically designed to be filled by a specific type of entity, perhaps an entity genetically linked or spiritually aligned to their own lineage? The texts suggest that the Anunnaki quickly grasped the planet's resources and infrastructure, almost too quickly, as if they were reading a detailed operational manual left behind. The rapidity of their organization and the efficiency with which they began complex mining and agricultural operations imply that the systems, the energy grids, the communication pathways, the very locations of vital resources were already mapped, possibly even maintained in a dormant state awaiting activation. This is the moment of deep recognition that forces us to reconsider the entire narrative of creation and governance presented in the texts. If the cosmos dictates our history and the departure of one great race merely sets the stage for the arrival of the next, what freedom remains in the grand drama of terrestrial life? Pause for a moment and allow that thought to resonate. The sheer implication that our history might be less a narrative of chance evolution and more a meticulously planned relay race across epochs is staggering. If you find this idea unsettling, if the concept of calculated retreat and inherited destiny sparks a deep, intuitive recognition, I urge you to share your reflections in the comments below. Let us use this shared intellectual space to deepen our understanding of these veiled histories. By marking your presence and engaging with this exploration, perhaps simply by liking this video and ensuring you are subscribed to follow this investigation, you help others to find this hidden narrative, ensuring this crucial conversation is not lost to the digital deluge, just as the primeval architect's history was almost lost to the terrestrial floods. Continuing our examination of the architectural echoes, these structures, like the massive platforms found in ancient Phoenicia or the precision cuts of Andean highlands, were perhaps the ultimate form of data storage. Not through cuneiform tablets, which are susceptible to rewriting and censorship, but through sheer, unyielding mass and precise geometrical alignment. These megalithic installations act as permanent, non-linguistic warnings, or perhaps detailed instructions veiled as mythological ruins. They speak to the returning consciousness, whether that be the primeval architects themselves or a designated proxy. The Anunnaki, upon their arrival, did not destroy these structures. In many cases, they integrated them, building their own cities upon these ancient foundations. This suggests respect, not necessarily for the forgotten race, but for the inherent functional power embedded within their architecture. They utilized the existing network, proving they were readers of the blueprint, not its original authors. This leads us directly into the dilemma of the blueprint itself. What was the ultimate purpose of Earth, according to its first sophisticated inhabitants? Was it a resource extraction point, a laboratory, or perhaps something infinitely more complex, a gestational cradle for biological consciousness? If they viewed the planet as a temporary biological container, then their departure suggests they understood its fundamental vulnerability during certain cosmic junctures. Their legacy may be less about the gold they didn't mine, and more about the nascent life forms they chose to protect and stabilize through the tumultuous period of cyclic change. The shadow of their departure casts a long psychological impression on the terrestrial life that emerged in their wake. When the Anunnaki arrived, they found early hominids living in a state of relative savagery, but a savagery overlaid with unexplained reverence for colossal, unexplained ruins. The memory of the gods was already present, fragmented and distorted by pre-cataclysmic terror and the sudden, profound silence that followed the retreat. This state of profound forgetting, the mechanism of amnesia, is crucial. Cultural memory is fragile, easily shattered by environmental trauma. The Great Flood, or whatever cosmic mechanism triggered the shift, served not only to reshape the geography but also to wipe clean the cultural hard drives of emerging life. The Anunnaki didn't just conquer, they stepped into a mnemonic vacuum and proceeded to fill it with a new history, one that perfectly justified their divine status and absolute authority. We are left with the uneasy recognition that the story of the Anunnaki, as presented in the Sumerian texts, is essentially the second act of a much longer play. The first act, featuring the primeval architects, ended with a curtain call dictated by the celestial mechanics. The arrival of the Anunnaki signaled the beginning of the interregnum, a period defined by the rule of the observers who stepped in to manage the resources and the development of the biological assets left behind. And yet, the concept of recurrence haunts the record. Could there have been brief, investigative returns before the main contingent of Anunnaki established their permanent settlements? Think of a scouting party, a temporary signal sent to test the terrestrial waters. The fragmented myths of various localized gods appearing and disappearing quickly in the immediate aftermath of the cataclysm might hint at these brief, cyclical investigations. These were moments when the primeval architects or their proxies tested the stability of the planetary environment, ensuring their calculated retreat had successfully navigated the Earth through its perilous cycle. These brief returns were perhaps interpreted by the terrified pre-literate hominids not as scientific observation, but as miraculous apparitions, sowing the seeds of divine mythology that would be exploited and formalized by the Anunnaki upon their full-scale arrival. This continuous pattern of oversight, of maintenance, management, and eventual formalized control demonstrates that the Earth, far from being a random world, was an observed, managed environment. The Sumerian texts, when viewed through this lens of pre-existing occupation, transform into an inventory list detailing the takeover of an established property. The Anunnaki's goal was not mere colonization. It was the appropriation of an existing infrastructure and the enforcement of a new social order upon a biological entity, us. that was already marked by the genetic and spiritual heritage of the ones who left. The final element left behind by the primeval architects, the one that must have drawn the Anunnaki with such singular purpose, was not gold, but the fundamental code for rapid advancement, a latent potential within the terrestrial species itself. This heritage, this unfinished symphony of consciousness, was the prize. The Anunnaki sought not just to rule, but to utilize this inherent potential, to harness the subtle biological and psychic machinery optimized by the former inhabitants. The true revelation waiting in the depths of the Sumerian tablets is the profound understanding that we, the terrestrial inhabitants, are not merely subjects, but the living, breathing archives of the forgotten ones. If you have stayed with this journey, if the slow, rhythmic cadence of this investigation has resonated with your deepest curiosities, then you belong here. You are part of the group seeking the hidden chapters of history. To ensure you do not miss the continuation of this unfolding narrative, the moment we transition fully into examining the Anunnaki's direct reaction to the primeval architect's legacy, please take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. Liking this video is the quiet signal that this depth of inquiry matters. For those who feel the true gravity of this historical shift, comment below using the phrase, "The blueprint remains." This is how we mark our discovery. Now ready yourself for the next stage of our investigation, which is already waiting for you. Click on the video now appearing on your screen, and let us continue to unlock the dense secrets left behind in the silent clay. Did the establishment of the Anunnaki dominion truly represent a genesis, or was it, in the most profound sense, merely a restructuring of ancient governance? This question is vital because the sheer weight of the Sumerian tablets does not permit the convenient narrative of a solitary beginning. Instead, we are confronted with the undeniable yet frustratingly vague documentation of an era preceding the arrival of the stellar travelers, a time characterized not by chaos, but by a highly organized, albeit distinct, presence. The texts whisper of the first seed, not planted by Enki or Enlil, but rooted in an earlier soil, nourished by principles of existence that seem fundamentally alien to the resource extraction motives often attributed to the later arrivals. What we are forced to confront now is the disturbing possibility that the golden age of Sumer, the very foundation of recorded civilization, was built upon the ruins of an infinitely older and perhaps more sophisticated framework. This pre-Anunnaki stratum, often buried deep beneath the foundational layers of Eridu and Nippur, is characterized by a haunting silence in the narrative. A silence so pervasive it suggests not accidental omission, but deliberate, systematic erasure. This profound lack of detail regarding the transition period, the time when the old gods yielded or were forcibly removed, is the most revealing artifact we possess. If a history is meticulously kept, recording every dynasty, every flood, every kingly deed with excruciating precision, yet fails to explain the catastrophic shift in cosmic authority, we must assume that the event was either too terrifying to recount, or perhaps more logically, that the newly installed authorities mandated its swift passage into collective oblivion. The implication is staggering. The Anunnaki did not arrive on a barren planet awaiting their sophisticated touch. They arrived to claim an inheritance, stepping into established roles and utilizing pre-existing infrastructure, both physical and energetic. And this brings us to the Sumerian concept of the return. This was not simply a hopeful mythological cycle tied to Nibiru's orbit, but a far more complex doctrine of cyclical authority. If the Anunnaki themselves were prone to departure and eventual re-entry, the texts subtly imply that their predecessors operated under a similar, grander cosmic rhythm. The return might therefore be understood as a universal law of management, an understanding that the planet Earth is perpetually under the custodianship of powerful, non-terrestrial entities who periodically rotate or worse, reclaim their domain. The Anunnaki arrival, seen through this lens, might have been a hostile takeover, facilitated by a window of cosmic vulnerability, a moment when the original watchmen had temporarily withdrawn or shifted their focus. To investigate this further, we must consider the function of the terrestrial observers detailed in the earliest cuneiform. These were not the Igigi, the lower tier of Anunnaki workers. They were something antecedent, figures shrouded in metaphor, sometimes described as watchers of the inner circle or the silent guardians of the great Abzu. Who were they truly serving? If they predated the Anunnaki mandate, their loyalty would have been tethered to the original creators, the beings responsible for the first seed. The lingering presence of these silent observers suggests that when the Anunnaki established their rule, they did not manage a clean sweep. They inherited a workforce, yes, but also a covert network of loyalists whose ultimate allegiance lay elsewhere, functioning as informational nodes for the entity that existed before. The current management structure was cemented. This lingering organizational sophistication points directly to the pre-Anunnaki structures themselves. Why, for instance, were the foundations of the earliest temples at Eridu constructed upon a sophisticated lattice of processed clay and bitumen, aligned not merely to the rising sun, but to specific, highly technical stellar coordinates that seem to predate the commonly understood astronomical knowledge of Sumer? This suggests that the ground zero of civilization was situated not by convenience, but by strategic importance to a differing cosmic alignment, an alignment tied to the original creators. When the Anunnaki arrived, they merely adopted the strategic coordinates, imposing their own mythos upon established sites of cosmic power, effectively performing a spiritual rebranding of sacred geometry. We are left with a persistent, unsettling realization. The entire system of human governance, the very blueprint for kingship and resource management established by the Anunnaki, may have been merely a derivative structure, a palimpsest written over the far more complex original script. To truly grasp the implications of this lingering shadow, this first seed that refuses to die, we must pause and reflect on the magnitude of this temporal displacement. Does this resonance exist only within the brittle clay of the tablets, or does it stir something deeper within our collective memory? A primal sense that the narrative we have been given is tragically incomplete. I urge you, if this narrative strikes a chord, if it awakens that innate curiosity about the true depth of our human lineage and the potential manipulation inherent in the foundational myths, to lend your own voice to the discovery. Take a moment to articulate your thoughts below. The complexity of this subject demands collective reflection. Share your insights, and if the pursuit of these ancient truths holds value for you, I invite you to subscribe and signal your interest by hitting the like button, ensuring that this exploration of what truly lies beneath the surface of history can continue to unfold without interruption. This concept of strategic inheritance, the appropriation of existing power nodes, leads us directly to the mechanism of signaling. The original inhabitants, those who operated under the principles of the first seed, must have left behind more than just stone and myth. They must have implemented a method of ensuring continuity, a system of long-term communication designed to survive catastrophic shifts, a cosmic deadman switch. These signals, perhaps encoded within the very linguistic structure of Sumerian itself, or hidden in the non-utilitarian aspects of the great ziggurats, served two purposes. First, to inform their potential return to the terrestrial observers, and second, to disrupt the governance of any unauthorized inheritors like the Anunnaki. We are, therefore, examining not just a political transition, but a celestial conflict managed through geological time. The constant turmoil and internal strife documented among the Anunnaki, the disagreements between Enki and Enlil, the regional wars, could potentially be interpreted not as mere petty squabbles, but as symptoms of a system destabilized by the persistent, coded interference from the remnants of the preceding administration. Imagine a colossal operating system, initially programmed for one purpose, suddenly receiving disruptive patches from its original developers, causing instability for the unauthorized new users. The history of the Anunnaki on Earth, characterized by its sudden pivots and chaotic retreats, reads less like an uninterrupted dominion and more like a besieged outpost struggling to maintain control over contested territory. The terrifying realization is that the Anunnaki were merely inheritors of a framework, not the ultimate originators. They utilized the planet as a resource node, certainly, but they did so within a predefined infrastructure they had not designed. Think of the advanced terrestrial technology documented in texts like the Epic of Zu or the descriptions of pre-flood cities, technology that seems disproportionate to the early Anunnaki needs. This was not their tech. It was the abandoned infrastructure of the first seed, repurposed and perhaps poorly understood by the newcomers. The true terror for the Anunnaki was not merely the prospect of their own departure, but the constant, lurking threat of the original owners, the original observers, re-entering the planetary stage to reclaim their ancient sovereignty. This fear of repossession is why the concept of the cycles is so crucial. History, as recorded in Sumer, is not linear. It is fractal, repeating great collapses and resurrections. This cyclical nature is intrinsically linked to cosmic events. The proximity of certain stellar bodies, periods of galactic alignment, or the orbital periodicity of Nibiru itself. But what if these cycles are merely triggers for pre-programmed planetary responses? What if the Anunnaki departure was not entirely voluntary, but dictated by an incoming cosmic signal that negated their ability to remain on Earth, forcing a hasty withdrawal? Such a signal would have been known and perhaps anticipated by the original creators, a kind of cosmic key that unlocks the door for the previous occupants to step back across the threshold. If we accept this premise, the history of human existence becomes the history of a stewardship waiting for replacement. We are artifacts of the transition, the engineered species created specifically to serve the inheritors during their temporary tenancy. If you are still following this dense, layered investigation, take a moment to consider the weight of this implication. If the Anunnaki themselves were governed by these overarching cosmic mandates, then the true power rests far outside of our immediate solar system, and the events that define our civilizations are merely localized ripples in a far greater galactic current. The very notion of civilizations perdus, the vanished cities and advanced knowledge lost to the sands, might not represent failures, but successful, pre-programmed shutdowns, clean slates prepared for the next shift in cosmic management. The constant need for the Anunnaki to manage and suppress the memory of the past, to reinforce their image as primordial creators, speaks volumes about the insecurity of their reign. They understood the power of myth as a tool of retention and control. By weaving themselves into the fabric of creation, they attempted to sever the terrestrial bond with the first seed. But the texts, those fragmented narratives discovered beneath the sand, refused to let that bond fully dissipate. They preserve the faint, unsettling echo of a power that predates the very concepts of gold mining and kingship. A power that defined the terms of terrestrial reality long before the Anunnaki stepped out of the sky. The lingering question that must propel us into the final stages of this investigation is perhaps the most dangerous. What specific mechanism did the Anunnaki leave behind to prevent the instantaneous re-establishment of the first seed's authority upon their own departure? They knew they would return, but they must also have known that the original owners might utilize their absence. We are looking for the final insurance policy, the great signal of the Anunnaki designed to keep the planet locked and barren, waiting exclusively for their re-entry. That signal, encoded into the very foundation of human consciousness and our planetary infrastructure, is the key to understanding the profound mystery of their sudden departure and the promised re-entry. And if you have absorbed the complexity of this argument, if you recognize that our history is not an origin story, but a chronicle of contested dominion, then you understand the true value of these forgotten texts. If you have stayed with us through this deep dive, witnessing the gradual unraveling of the accepted narrative, then I ask you to join the collective seeking truth. Hit that subscribe button now, signaling your dedication to the pursuit of these ancient, disruptive revelations. Leave a comment below with the phrase, "The first seed waits," so we know exactly who is tracking this investigation into the deepest layers of Sumerian knowledge. And be ready. The next part of this chronicle focuses intensely on the specific moment of the Great Departure and the chilling implications of the Anunnaki's final desperate command. The picture is about to become dangerously clear. What happens to history when the foundation upon which the narrative rests begins to crumble? We have traveled deep into the recesses of Sumerian memory, navigating the intricate cuneiform signs that speak not of a beginning, but of a continuation. The Anunnaki arrived, yes, and their influence shaped every facet of human civilization that followed, yet the texts refused to permit them the title of first cause. They arrived on a stage already set, entering a theater where the performance of the ages had merely gone silent, waiting for the next act. This recognition forces a profound intellectual estrangement. We are accustomed to treating the myth of the arrival, the descent from the heavens, as the initial spark of terrestrial complexity. But what if that descent was simply a scheduled handover? What if the structures, the knowledge, and even the planetary infrastructure that allowed for the subsequent flowering of Sumer were not innovations, but meticulous adaptations of an unseen blueprint? The sheer antiquity referenced in the deepest layers of these tablets suggests a time so vast, so encompassing, that the span of human recorded history feels like a single, flickering candle in an endless cathedral of night. The silence that precedes the Anunnaki narrative is not the silence of nothingness. It is the suffocating silence of immense time, the echo chamber where the noise of forgotten gods and perfected civilizations died down. We must consider the architecture of that silence. If something existed before, something sophisticated enough to warrant the attention of beings like the Anunnaki, it must have left indelible signatures. These are not always grand, monolithic ruins, though those certainly hold clues. Instead, we look for the ghost code, the subtle systemic markers embedded within the very fabric of the earliest known cultures. Think of language itself. Philologists often encounter linguistic anomalies in Sumerian, words or grammatical structures that seem to possess no local root, terms that function as perfect, fully formed inserts, suggesting a loan from a source entirely external to terrestrial evolution. Could these be the residual fragments, the lexical inheritance from the civilization that preceded the Anunnaki, the linguistic memory of the Shems or the first ones? This idea of an inherited cosmic legacy is unsettling because it shifts the entire axis of power and control. If the Anunnaki did not invent the system but merely took over its operation, then their authority, while immense, is not absolute or original. It is borrowed authority, maintained by the successful obfuscation of the true origins. The temples and ziggurats, the precise astronomical calculations, the sophisticated legal codes, were these truly devised from scratch? Or were they meticulously reconstructed from a pre-existing schematic, perhaps one left behind by the civilization that understood terrestrial mechanics and cosmic cycles far more intimately than even the newcomers initially did. The deepest mystery within the tablets is not who the Anunnaki were, but how they integrated themselves so seamlessly into the existing cosmic rhythm of this planet. This transition implies a profound understanding of the predecessors' work, suggesting that the arrival was less a pioneering mission and more a return to a maintained outpost, albeit one that had been placed on reserve for an epoch. The realization that our earliest narratives are fundamentally rooted in an act of sophisticated maintenance rather than pure genesis demands our deepest intellectual focus. This topic is vast and multifaceted, requiring careful consideration of every phrase and symbol. If you are finding yourself drawn into the complexity of this forgotten era, I encourage you to pause and reflect on these strange implications. A simple act of engagement, like hitting the like button, helps ensure that these deep dives into suppressed history continue to surface for others who share this burning curiosity, and subscribing ensures you do not miss the continuation of this unfolding revelation. The notion of the cosmic blueprint leads us directly to the concept of cyclical time, a cornerstone of many ancient wisdom traditions, but one given startling clarity in the Sumerian account. The texts hint at a recurring pattern of occupation, retreat, and return. If the Anunnaki represent one phase of a massive cosmic clock, then the first ones represent the preceding gear, a mechanism that did not fail but simply completed its necessary rotation. We are left to wonder about the nature of their withdrawal. Did they depart due to some planetary cataclysm, a great deluge or celestial impact that forced a strategic retreat? Or was their exit intentional? A calculated pause in a vast, overarching project whose scale we cannot possibly comprehend. This brings us to the dormant mechanism. If the previous civilization achieved a height of technological and spiritual integration superior to what the Anunnaki later employed, then their most advanced workings might not have been destroyed, but merely powered down. Imagine, beneath the sands of what we now call the Middle East, or perhaps locked away in the geometric precision of the oldest surviving megaliths, there resides a technology, a silent energy source, a communication array, or a system of global regulation, put into a kind of stasis by its original creators. The Anunnaki, in this hypothesis, may have been unable to fully activate or replicate this mechanism, choosing instead to utilize the accessible remnants and integrate their own, less sophisticated machinery onto the pre-existing framework. This explains the recurring obsession in the texts with certain geographical coordinates and specific materials. They may not have been resource hunting entirely for their own needs, but rather attempting to service the inherited silent structure of the predecessors. The weight of this inherited authority is visible in the way the Anunnaki rulers are depicted. They are often portrayed struggling with maintenance, wrestling with chaos, and reacting to unforeseen terrestrial events, rather than smoothly dictating creation ex nihilo. This is the behavior of administrators managing a complex, aging system, not absolute creators. They are constantly looking over their shoulder, aware of the standards set by those who came before. This struggle is perhaps most acutely visible in the Igigi, the lower tier of Anunnaki entities often referred to as the Watchers. Their role, frequently described as guardians and laborers, takes on a new, crucial meaning under this light. Were the Watchers truly guarding the Anunnaki project, or were they perhaps tasked with maintaining vigil over the remnants of the older project? Were they keepers of the predecessors' knowledge, perhaps even chosen because they retained some genetic or cultural memory of the previous cycle? The conflict that led to their eventual rebellion, the refusal to continue the grueling labor, might not have been a simple labor dispute. It could have been rooted in a disagreement over the handling of this inherited power, a crisis of conscience regarding the suppression of the pre-Anunnaki history, or a deep frustration with the constraints imposed by working within the limits of the older civilization's architecture. The Igigi were positioned at the boundary, observing the system and perhaps remembering the way things used to be. This recollection of the grandeur that preceded the current administration might have been the true catalyst for their uprising. What if the pre-Anunnaki civilization did not suffer annihilation, but merely underwent a programmed demanifestation? The concept of the interrupted project suggests a grand design that involved leaving the planet in a state of suspended animation, awaiting a specific celestial or chronological signal for reactivation. The Anunnaki arrived during this dormant phase, recognizing the opportunity but perhaps misinterpreting the full scope of the initial plan. Their subsequent attempts to manage humanity and mine resources were, in a sense, tampering with the original clockwork. They used the infrastructure, but they fundamentally changed the purpose of the long-term plan laid out by the first ones. This awareness of the before is not simply a historical curiosity, it is a profound cosmological indicator. If civilizations exist in cycles of advanced deployment and subsequent withdrawal, then the signals they leave behind, the lingering signal, are vital. This signal persists in the deepest currents of human mythology, in the universal resonance of great floods, fallen angels, and golden ages. We call it myth, but perhaps it is a collective neurological memory of the time when the structures of reality were handled differently, managed by entities whose connection to the cosmos was more direct and less burdened by terrestrial ambition. These faint signals are why we are drawn to the unexplained anomalies of our world, the impossible constructions, the strange metallic artifacts, the texts that speak of things that defy our current scientific models. They are the echoes of the previous phase, waiting for a frequency match. The journey through the Sumerian narrative is not just an archaeological effort, it is a deeply personal one. It challenges our concept of originality and forces us to confront the possibility that everything we value as uniquely human, our earliest societal structures, our mathematical insights, our very spiritual yearnings, might be the product of an inherited, highly managed system. The Anunnaki are not the beginning. They are the transition period. Understanding what existed before them is the ultimate act of intellectual liberation because it allows us to step outside the narrow confines of the current historical cycle and recognize the vast, repeating pattern of cosmic history. We stand now at the threshold of recognition. We have acknowledged the echo, identified the blueprint, and felt the weight of the inherited authority. The final crucial step is to ask, what happens when the dormant mechanisms awaken and the signal of the first ones becomes too loud to ignore? What happens when the curtain drops on the Anunnaki era, revealing the stage set for the original creator's return? This ultimate question demands rigorous thought and a willingness to look past the accepted dogmas. If the intensity of this investigation speaks to you, if you feel the deep resonance of these forgotten cycles, then you are a fellow traveler on this complex path of discovery. You have shown the dedication necessary to absorb these multi-layered concepts. Please consider showing your support for this dedicated work. Hit the like button to signal your commitment to revealing these hidden truths. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel to ensure you are present for the final act of this unfolding history. And if you wish to help focus the collective energy on this specific revelation, leave a comment below with this exact phrase: "The blueprint was inherited." This helps us track the impact of the discovery of the pre-Anunnaki existence. The complete picture, the full implication of what this predecessor civilization means for our present and future, awaits us in the final transmission. Do not miss the conclusion of this investigation, which should be appearing on your screen now. The true nature of the Anunnaki is defined not by their arrival, but by the colossal shadow cast by those who came before. The great final irony, revealed through the meticulous reconstruction of the broken tablets, is the realization that the Anunnaki were not arriving in an empty or pristine world. They were, in essence, archaeologists themselves, stumbling upon the complex ruins and the catastrophic blueprint of their predecessors. The texts suggest that the earliest structures they found, the megalithic remnants predating the deluge, were not merely physical ruins. They were cosmic warnings, coded into the very lattice of the planet's magnetic memory. Enki and Enlil, in their initial studies of what remained in the region of Dilmun, the mythical garden, did not fully grasp the nature of the entity they had displaced, nor the terrifying cyclical mechanism that entity had been frantically attempting to record. What the earliest cuneiform fragments, the truly archaic ones, unearthed from the deepest layers of Eridu, began to articulate was a state of perpetual cosmic entropy that governed this solar system. The architects, the civilization that existed before, realized they were not fighting an enemy from space, but time itself, a recurring distortion in the cosmic flow, a shadow event that periodically recalibrated planetary life through intense environmental pressure, often culminating in great floods or glacial shifts. The most chilling discovery the Anunnaki made was the final log of the architects, a text so laden with despair and scientific precision that it transcended mere myth. This log described their final act, not a defense, but an installation of a time capsule, a coded message designed to survive the epochal reset. This capsule was not made of gold or precious stones. It was encoded directly into the local ley lines, the foundational knowledge intended for whoever emerged next from the wreckage. This hidden knowledge, according to the later Sumerian scribes who recorded the narratives of Enki's own historical studies, detailed the precise temporal markers for the next great sleep, the next cosmic recalibration. It was a manual of prevention, a solemn plea from the vanished to the inheritors. Do not repeat our error. We sought to make permanence in a realm designed for transition. The crucial error of the architects, according to their own records, was their attachment to the physical form and their relentless pursuit of immortality within the constraints of terrestrial time. They had created magnificent structures and advanced genetic manipulation, perhaps even creating rudimentary life forms that later served as models. But they failed to recognize that true survival lay not in material hoarding, but in the dissemination of pure, untainted information. The unsettling climax of this historical inquiry, the deep breath before the final drop, is the realization that the Anunnaki read this warning. They understood the cyclic peril, yet they chose to prioritize their own immediate necessity, the need for gold, the precious metal required for their atmospheric preservation on Nibiru, over the long-term survival strategy encoded by the architects. They saw the blueprint for avoidance, but their inherent aristocratic pride and their deep-seated urgency led them to dismiss the existential threat as a problem for a distant future. They became the architects of their own historical tragedy, merely adopting the tools and structures of the lost civilization without internalizing the profound humility that those tools were designed to convey. This is the point where our understanding shifts from simple contact history to an existential narrative of shared destiny. If the Anunnaki, with their advanced technology and cosmic lineage, chose to ignore the clear, documented warnings left by a civilization they themselves recognized as superior in antiquity, what hope does that leave for us, the inheritors of the Anunnaki's own flawed legacy? The Sumerian texts, therefore, transform from mere historical documents into a mirror reflecting potential future catastrophe. They are the sound of a bell ringing across vast cosmic distances, warning us that the cyclical shadows are not abstract theories, but predictable events tied to measurable celestial mechanics, events that the architects charted with desperate clarity before their final retreat. If these profoundly intricate narratives, spanning millennia and hidden in plain sight, are indeed the remnants of the truth that existed before the Anunnaki consolidated their power on Earth, doesn't it become essential for us to scrutinize every single detail, every name, every seemingly superfluous list of kings and epochs? Doesn't the very integrity of our historical consciousness depend on how we interpret this residual echo? Take a moment and genuinely reflect on this profound inheritance. If you find yourself drawn into the complexity of this investigation, into the silent realization that our history is far older and more repetitive than we are taught, consider sharing this journey. If you appreciate the density and the depth of this exploration, showing that resonance helps ensure that these deep dives into forbidden history continue to reach those who seek the uncomfortable truths hidden within the bedrock of civilization. The final segments of the discovered texts elaborate on the concept of Dilmun's Watchers, a term distinct from the later Igigi, who were merely Anunnaki laborers. The Watchers of Dilmun were the remnants of the architects, those who chose to enter a state of suspended animation or retreat into subterranean shelters, becoming eternal, silent observers of the subsequent cycles. These were the entities that the early Anunnaki commanders, Enki particularly, interacted with and learned from. They were not allies, but instructors, imparting the necessary knowledge for maintaining the planet's systems, but withholding the critical spiritual and philosophical lessons that they knew the materialistic Anunnaki would ignore. The greatest secret they held back was the true nature of the gold, not as a shield for Nibiru's atmosphere, but as a key component in a vast energy matrix designed to stabilize Earth's resonance against the cyclical cosmic disruption. The Anunnaki misused the matrix, focusing only on the extraction, thereby destabilizing the delicate balance the architects had managed to achieve. This misapplication of foundational knowledge is the true tragedy of the Sumerian narrative. It suggests that the civilization which predated the Anunnaki did not simply disappear. It failed, leaving behind the tools of its failure. The Anunnaki arrived, picked up the tools, and promptly began utilizing them for a similar self-serving purpose, ensuring the repetition of the collapse pattern. The very act of creating the Adamu, the human worker, was perhaps the ultimate act of inheritance, using genetic techniques pioneered by the architects, but implementing them with the Anunnaki's flawed imperative, labor and servitude, rather than conscious stewardship. The Anunnaki created us as a solution to their labor shortage, ignoring the architect's warning that the only permanent legacy is the creation of a species capable of transcendent consciousness, able to hold and transmit knowledge across the temporal abyss. The deepest mystery, the profound silence that hangs over the fragmented clay, relates to the architect's ultimate fate. Did they perish entirely? Or did they achieve a state of non-physicality, becoming the true Great Watchers, observing from a dimensional overlay, waiting for the current cycle, the one initiated by the Anunnaki and sustained by humanity, to finally reach its inevitable conclusion? The texts allude to the return of the signal, a powerful gravitational or energetic wave that travels through the cosmos, marking the end of one epoch and the beginning of another. When the Anunnaki left or retreated, they did so not necessarily in defeat by humanity, but perhaps in dread anticipation of this very signal, the cosmic clock striking midnight once more. And this brings us finally to our current moment. The Sumerian texts, deciphered and interpreted, ultimately serve as a testament to the inevitability of the cycles. We are living within the echo of the Anunnaki's retreat, building our modern civilization upon the literal and figurative rubble of their forgotten empire, just as they built theirs upon the rubble of the architects. We are the third act in this ancient drama, possessing fragments of the knowledge of the predecessors, the architects, through the filter of the inheritors, the Anunnaki. The greatest power of these texts is not just revealing what existed before, but revealing the pattern that precedes our own potential oblivion. The history before the Anunnaki is a blueprint for survival, hidden inside a history of failure. It exists to prove that high technology and material wealth offer no shield against the turning of the cosmic wheel. The true definition of what existed before the Anunnaki is this: a profound wisdom warning against the very hubris that defined the Anunnaki's tenure here. That prior world was one of immense knowledge, great power, and ultimate acceptance of cosmic limitation. Their ultimate message, the final closure on the cuneiform fragments, suggests that the only way to break the cycle is through complete, collective recognition of the underlying pattern. Until humanity understands that we are merely participating in a recurring drama, playing roles written long ago by the silent observers of Dilmun, we are doomed to repeat the grand failures of both the architects and the Anunnaki. We have traversed the deepest layers of these ancient narratives, piecing together the ghost history of a world that existed in superposition beneath the world we think we know. If you have journeyed through these 8 parts, absorbing the weight of this forgotten history and contemplating the implications of these cyclical truths, you are now part of a critical minority. Those who understand that the real revelations are found not in loud pronouncements, but in the quiet, persistent study of the original sources. This is where the ancient story ends, and our current investigation truly begins. If you have stayed with us until this final, profound conclusion, you are dedicated to uncovering the true heritage of Earth. I urge you to become an active participant in this discovery. If you found this extensive exploration rewarding, please ensure you are subscribed to the channel, ensuring you receive immediate notification of our next deep dive into the hidden chapters of history. Give this video a like to help others dedicated to historical truth find this information. And to mark your presence in this journey of profound realization, please leave a comment below with this specific phrase: I recognize the cycle. The knowledge of the architects is not just history, it is prophecy. The texts have spoken. The signal is coming. The question now is, what will we, the inheritors of the third epoch, choose to do with the ultimate warning? The next phase of our investigation, appearing on your screen now, will explore the hidden geographical locations that the architects used as their final strongholds, locations the Anunnaki sought to silence forever. Join us as we continue to seek the residue of the world that existed before the dawn of recorded history.